So let's continue on. Who should be involved in recruiting? I've already given you some brief examples. All right, we talked about the HR professional in the recruiting professional in the HR department. We talked about the hiring manager, the person who's going to be the boss. We've talked about the job incumbent, the person who is currently in the position now, and that generally is most of the people involved in the process. But recruiters aren't just sometimes in larger companies, you may end up having an internal and an external recruiter. So you have somebody who's responsible for all the internal recruiting, and they might work hand in hand with training and development. And then you have an external recruiter who is much more focused on the external sources. And that internal and external recruiter would work well together. Sometimes you don't have the fortunate good luck to have two separate recruiters, one internal, one external. Again, larger companies have this, but smaller companies tend to just be one position, the recruiter. And so they need to be familiar with all the internal processes for sourcing candidates internally and the external processes for sourcing them externally. Employees, any employee, but the best employee, of course, is your job incumbent for helping with recruiting. But any employee who is a peer of the position that you are going to be recruiting for is very helpful in the recruiting process. Hiring managers are incredibly important in that. So the recruiter should be able to relate to a targeted recruit and persuade him or her to apply or accept a job. So making sure that the person who is doing the recruiting has all those characteristics that we were talking about. They're enthusiastic, they're persuasive, they're willing, they want that person to stay in the process, and they're not being a used car salesperson about it. They're being honest about what to expect and why they expect it. So that's important. There are multiple factors that influence whether or not your recruiter is going to be effective. Let's assume you have the best recruiter possible. That still doesn't mean that you're going to be able to be as effective as possible, simply because there are many factors that are out of the recruiter's hands, and they have to adjust to do the best job they can given those constraints. And the first one that we should consider is the organization's characteristics. We spent time already talking about spillover effects, applicant reactions to the selection process, how important it is to make sure that the company's reputation and the way that we treat them and the word of mouth that gets out there, that's all done well. All right. And even if you have a good reputation, it still may be the organization is working in an industry that is a dirty industry. No matter, even if they're a good employer, it may be challenging to get somebody to work for an oil refinery or to work for a company that makes chemicals or a company that may have a product that you don't like or you disagree with, right? So the more controversial the product or service that the company offers, even if they're a good employer, the more challenging it can be sometimes to recruit people. And I can imagine that Monsanto can struggle with this, particularly for people that don't agree with Monsanto's mission or they have some concerns about what Monsanto does. And I know plenty of people that don't like Monsanto as much as I know almost as many people who like Monsanto, right? They're a great employer, but part of their struggle is, they're involved in chemicals and they're involved in environmental issues and agricultural issues that can be controversial. So those controversial issues make them a challenge when it comes to the branding and the recruiting message that you're trying to communicate. Monsanto is an awesome employer, and I would highly recommend them as an employer. Characteristics of the job also can impact the ability of your recruiter to be effective. For example, if some of the job characteristics are you have to work nights or you have to work weekends or you have to be on your feet all the time or you're going to be working in a really cold environment or really hot environment, the characteristics of the job, if the job is not a pleasant job, no matter how good you are at recruiting, it's still going to be hard to find people who want to take that job. And that's also an important consideration. Next is the hiring managers. And I've known plenty of times where I've seen people try to attract good people for a company, but once that candidate meets their hiring manager, they go, I would never want to work for this person. They're a jerk. Or, oh my God, this person is so kind. I really want to go work for them. That hiring manager can make or break that experience. So no matter how good you are at attracting people, your effectiveness is oftentimes judged based on characteristics that you can't control: the organization, the job, the hiring managers, and as well the coworkers, right? The next bubble over. If you can't control how the coworkers experience the new recruit, how they're going to treat them during the hiring process, same as the hiring manager. And if you can't control that, that's going to be a challenge for you. So you may be an excellent recruiter, but if you're trying to recruit in the middle of an organization that's got some struggles, you're and with unpleasant people that they'll be working with, that makes it a little bit harder for them to manage that. Next and last is the labor market itself. Depending on what economic conditions are like, hey, if it's a lousy economy and there are and you don't have a lot of vacancies, but boy, you've got a lot of people looking for jobs, your job's a lot easier. You can be picky. You can sit back and wait till you get the right person for the job. And since you'll have a lot more applicants during a lousy economy than you will during a good economy, you should take that into account. In a good economy, there are less people looking and there are way more vacancies than there are people looking for jobs. So it starts to shift. So bad economy is good for recruiting. A good economy is bad for recruiting because it has an opposite effect. So you need to be aware of what's going on in your economy. If you've got a low unemployment rate, it's going to be really hard to find people, no matter how good of an employer you are, no matter how good the job is, no matter how good the coworkers are. If you have a really bad job market with very low unemployment, there's not a lot of people who are looking for jobs. You're going to have to probably pay a little bit more money to use some unusual resources, source options, as we talked about in the previous lecture, to find the right people for the job. You may have to spend more money for headhunters or travel to find people in different locations where the unemployment rate's a little bit different than the one that you're experiencing. Part of our responsibility in the HR department is to ensure that our recruiters have the skill set that they need. So if I am using someone in HR, then of course I can hire someone who I know has the KSAs that I need to be an effective recruiter. But if I am the recruiter in the recruitment position in the company, in the HR department, but I am going to be utilizing people throughout the organization, my hiring managers, my employees, I'm using them, I need to make sure they are trained well to actively engage in the recruitment process. Particularly if I'm sending people to job fairs and things like that on college campuses. Those people have to be trained well how to represent the company. So what are some things we need to consider? Table 7.2 in your textbook addresses that. You need to have good knowledge about what recruiting is, how to attract people, be careful of the legal issues, right? And so that recruiting knowledge, also ties into that legal issue further down on that list. But recruiting knowledge is, what does it mean to attract people? What does it mean in terms of a realistic job preview? They need some basic recruitment 101 information. You need to make sure that the people that you're choosing have really good interpersonal skills. They have a good firm handshake. They make eye contact. They communicate clearly. And they present themselves in a really professional manner. Presentation skills, also incredibly important. Making sure that the person that knows how to make a presentation about the company, about its strengths and weaknesses. They can speak extemporaneously. They know how to answer and field questions appropriately from people. Presentation skills are important. They need to also understand the organization's goals and recruiting objectives. And so in your training, people need to be aware of what is it that the company wants to accomplish with recruiting, and then, what is it that the company wants to accomplish, and that how does it influence and impact the recruiting objectives. The legal issues overplay all of these, right? You want to make sure that people understand the legal terminology, what discrimination looks like, what to write down, what not to write down, right? You can't control what people think, but the last thing you want is somebody writing down things that demonstrate that they were letting bias into their selection process. So it's important that we address that. You want to make sure that they are aware of the different kinds of assessments that will be used during the recruiting process, so that they know what tools we are using. They have to be familiar with what those screening mechanisms are. And if they're not familiar with those screening mechanisms, they need to be made aware of that and trained in how to administer them or use them. And then applicant attraction. They need to be familiar with what that means in terms of interpersonal justice, procedural justice, and distributive justice, making sure that our applicants feel like the process is fair. And if they feel like the process is fair, then they're going to feel like the outcome is fair. So going into a little bit more detail on recruiter goals, because this is an important aspect for the standards that we set for ourselves for the recruiting process, and then how do we determine whether or not we were successful. So we have to make clear what it is that is our goal, and then how our branding, screening, and attraction of the applicant is going to be influenced by the recruiting goals that we have. So sometimes we want to make sure that we are representing ourselves with a particular vision. Many companies have a really clear message that they want to communicate to their recruiters about what they do. Now, for example, you want to go work for Southwest Airlines. I think that you could probably guess what it is their employer brand. Their employer brand is fun. They want people to have fun, whether it's the applicant, whether it's the employee, or whether it's the HR department or the hiring manager. Everybody is supposed to have fun working for Southwest Airlines. So that's the brand. So the recruiting message needs to communicate that brand. So oftentimes when you're hiring, particularly if you're hiring people for person-organization match over person-job match, your job in the recruiting process is to weed out the people that won't work well in your organization culture. You want to be able to find the people who are going to make that person-organization match and are going to fit in well, and then you can worry about training them on the skills they need on the job later. So particularly when our staffing strategy is to hire people for person-organization match, employer branding is really important, because we need people to match and to fit into that culture and that brand, whatever that is. Candidate screening is important. We need to make sure we set the standards really clear for what minimum standards we're looking for in terms of KSAs, experience, knowledge, training, education, you name it. And then the other thing that we might want to make sure that we're doing in setting good goals for recruiters and recruiting activities is, what are we going to do to make sure we keep people's interest? Because that's the job of recruiting, is attracting them and keeping them interested, so that the attributes of the job and the company and the department that they'll be working in are the things that keep them in the process downstream. But upstream, it's all on the recruiter to get that job done. A recruiter has to help facilitate the organization's goals. So the recruiter needs to know what the company's goals are. If you are not clear with your recruiter, what is it you expect, what are the goals and strategies that you're trying to accomplish in the company, this is going to be a big problem. And so the recruiter needs to know if the people that they've attracted are actually meeting those expectations. That's a really important part of that. As in anything, be careful about the kinds of incentives that you set up for your employees. Number one, the recruiter incentives recognize that people will only behave in a way consistent with the rewards that they're going to get for the job. So if you set up a reward system in such a way that doesn't reward people for getting you candidates that are high quality or that stay with the company longer than 6 months, that's not what you're going to get, right? If you say, I want to, make sure I've got a warm body to fill this position, that's all you're going to get, and that's not necessarily going to be effective. So the behaviors and outcomes that are rewarded are the ones that, will be pursued by the recruiter. So make sure your incentives, your behaviors and outcomes are incredibly clear, what you want your recruiter to do and how they will be rewarded for doing that. So it has to be embedded in your pay for performance system. I want to make sure we have rewards that align with staffing goals. So if we set a goal for ensuring that we've got high quality, if we've got process goals or we've got outcome goals, right? We've talked about that in the first module, process goals and outcomes goals. Those rewards have to be in alignment with making sure the recruiter achieves those process and outcome goals, all right? We want to make sure that we're thinking about long-term versus short-term goals, because short-term goals might be, we need somebody to fill this position right away, but the long-term goal may be, we need somebody that can fill this position, but also be promoted 2 or 3 years from now in a sort of in an internal stream to get people up into more advanced positions, right? So we have our short-term goals and then we have our long-term goals, and we need to be able to balance those. We also make sure that we want to be thinking about team versus individual goals. If you've got an HR team that's going to be working on things, but you've got an individual who's not working with the team, that's going to be a problem. So be clear about the difference between team goals, individual goals, and not creating an uber competitive environment where people are sabotaging each other. We want to have a good setup. And we also want to have multiple layers of rewards, right? Rewards for individual, rewards for working in a team, rewards for working and achieving the organization's goals, et cetera, et cetera. Image is important because organizational image, employer image, all have a huge impact on the ability of the recruiter to be effective. So what are we thinking about when it comes to organization image? Well, imagine, close your eyes and think about, when you think about Anheuser-Busch as an employer, what's the image that comes to mind? We often think about baseball, or we might think about the Clydesdales, or we might think about those funky commercials that happen during the Super Bowl. Whatever it is, we have an image of what Anheuser-Busch is as an employer or as an organization, what they stand for in the area. And so your slides talk about Neiman Marcus or Goldman Sachs or Tiffany's. Well, what image comes to mind when you think about Neiman Marcus? Neiman Marcus is a high-end retailer that tends to have a more personalized service when it comes to buying clothes and apparel wear. Goldman Sachs has a high-end reputation as an investment banking firm. Tiffany's, right? In terms of jewelry, it's like that little blue box. So there's an image of luxury that goes along with the idea of who Tiffany's is. So there is an image that's attached to every organization's name. Apple has a reputation. Southwest has a reputation. Even Circle K and Wangang in Edwardsville has a reputation. All of these things are important to consider as you are trying to create the image in your recruiting message. So the organizational image, however, is going to differ depending on who your audience is, right? So certain types of people have certain expectations about image, and other people have different expectations and interpretations of images. So you need to know who your target audience is. This is, again, why marketing is a big part of what is recruiting, because what you're doing in marketing is understanding your target audience and delivering a message or a product or service that meets the needs of your target audience. Same thing when it comes to recruiting. Employer image is also a big part of this. And employer image is different than organization image because the organization can have a certain image, right? And then there's the image that they have as an employer in and of itself. So the organizational image is about who they are, what their reputation is, generally speaking, in terms of their products and services, and what they sell, whether their differentiation strategy, whether they're cost leadership like Walmart. Employer image is how do they treat their employees. So you can be a really good organization in terms of its organizational image, but their reputation as an employer may not be as polished or as positive as the organization's images. And so sometimes if you sort of, you lift up, you look behind the curtain and you're actually looking what that company's like, it's not so nice to work for them. And I did some temp work in New York City for a long time, while I was doing my MBA and before I went on to get my doctorate. And there are plenty of companies where Shearson Lehman Brothers, and actually at the time it was called Shearson Lehman, now it's just Shearson. And Shearson had a great reputation as a company, and they were really a good employer. Even as a temp, I really had a positive sense of what they were like as an employer and how they treated their employees. Alternatively, I went to work for Merrill Lynch as a temp only for a day, and it was immediate that I had a really strong impression that the person that I was temping for, as a secretary, was a jerk. And all that did was tell me that as an employer, Merrill Lynch really didn't care about how they treated their employees. So I really had some strong messages there. So be careful about differentiating between the organization image about what their products and services are and who they are as an employer, and recognize that those are two different things. And what you don't want is your employer image to drag down your organizational image, because it can then have those spillover effects that we were talking about. On this slide, it's table 7.3 in your textbook. These are great examples of branding slogans that reflect how the employer is viewed in the larger market, or how they want to be viewed in the larger employment market. For example, Johnson & Johnson, small company environment, big company impact. And what that is, it is a branding message that goes to potential employees to say, even though we have a big impact, we're a big company. They are global. They're huge. My cousin works for them. But they have a very small, intimate company, small company environment, so that you feel accepted, you feel that they care about you. Johnson & Johnson has been at the lead of, work-family balance and daycare, on-site daycare centers and all those sorts of things 25 years ago, 30 years ago. So these are important things to recognize. So Johnson & Johnson tries to let people know that even though their market is big, they work like a small company where they care about their employees. Eli Lilly in Indianapolis, innovation has a face, our people. So they value their employees, and they say the face of Eli Lilly are the people who work for it. So they value that. So that's communicating a message to potential employees. Medtronics, careers with a passion for life. So what they're saying is people who work for us have a passion for living, for their life. Abbott Labs, inspired to achieve, make a difference in your world. So they want people to make a difference. So Abbott Labs is all about research, and research changing lives and making things better for people. Sharp, right? From sharp minds come sharp products. And so they're saying, we want smart people. So these are all ways that the employer brand is being communicated to potential employees. So not only we're not trying to, these slogans are not for potential customers. These slogans are for potential employees. So we use these as recruiting tools, like any other marketing tool, to let people know, to signal to people what our recruiting message is about, what we are like as an employer, and we want to attract the best of the best. So, other things with respect to employer image. Number one, how an organization is reputed to treat applicants is likely to have an effect on applicant attraction. As I said, if you have a lousy reputation in terms of the way you treat your applicants and your employees, you're going to have a very difficult job attracting people to come work for you. Newer or lesser known organizations with a weak or non-existent image among job seekers are going to have problems attracting people. And so they're not going to be able to do a good job attracting passive recruitment sources. Active recruiters, of course, right? Because people want a job. So there's an opportunity, I'm going to apply for it. But the passive people, the ones that you have to lure away from an existing job to come and apply for yours, those are going to be a little bit more challenging. You're going to have to do a really good job selling people on why your company is good, even if it doesn't have a well-known reputation. And again, let me go back to my experience being recruited here at SIUE 12 years ago. SIUE's reputation is great as a regional employer, but I was working in upstate New York. I had no idea about SIUE. I was familiar with Carbondale, having gone to school in Wisconsin, but I was not familiar with SIU Edwardsville. So I didn't have much to say about Edwardsville or much that I knew about Edwardsville. And it was really important to me if I was going to go work for a school that I wanted to have a real good campus environment. I didn't want it to feel like it was a commuting school like going to SWIC or Lewis and Clark where people didn't hang around on campus. They came in, they took classes, and they left, right? I wanted a campus environment with a vibrant student life and a vibrant faculty life where people would get along with each other. And so what SIUE needed to do for me is let me know what it is that they offered that was different, unique, and that was more than simply, here's a job, and it's a job teaching and it's what you need, but they actually were able to convince me, because they were a little known company or a little known organization outside of the St. Louis area, what they had to offer and what they were doing that was great. And I'm, again, thrilled to be here and thrilled to be a part of this institution because it really is the best kept secret in Illinois. So the nature of the recruiting message, we've already talked about a whole bunch of different things that need to be in your recruiting message, particularly your employer branding message, your organizational image, all those sorts of things. But a couple things you should be aware of. Number one, that different types of recruiting materials attract the attention of different job seekers. So video might attract to some kind of people, but not others. Pamphlets might be attractive to some people, but not others. Good websites, absolutely. Good benefits and how you communicate it, it's good. So it is important to learn from your own people what it is that attracted them to your company so that you can capitalize on that to recruit for those particular positions. Message content should appeal to the goal and the values of the targeted recruits, right? This is about marketing and relationship building. So you need to know what it is that your targeted recruits are interested in, and you need to provide them with a message that they want to hear, whatever that is. Non-compensatory screening factors should be communicated to facilitate self-selection. So things like, what does a job entail? How many hours per week? Is it difficult job? Is it an easy job? Is it going to be, a job where I'm going to sit all the time, or am I going to be on my feet all the time? What's the pay? These are things that if you don't communicate that up front, you're going to end up with a bunch of people in your recruiting process who are not going to stay in the process once they find out where the job is, what does it entail, how hard is that job, what are the hours going to be, what is the working conditions going to be like. If you don't communicate that up front, they're not going to be interested in staying in the job. In this last slide, we talk about realistic job previews, how important it is in communicating our message out to applicants is to make sure we are giving them a realistic preview of what the job entails. That means providing them with both positive and negative attributes, things that people might be polarized about, right? So you have to work nights and weekends. Okay, for some people, that's awesome. For some people, that's not acceptable. But that's something that people need to know up front. That might be negative for some people, it might be positive for others, but we need to make sure that that information is being communicated clearly. Your job in a realistic preview is not to sell someone on the job like you would try to sell a car, right? Kicking the tires and saying, you're going to look awesome in this car, it's going to be the best thing you ever did. What you want to say is, this is what the car's attributes are like. This is what the organization's attributes are like. This is what you can expect in terms of the gas mileage. This is what you can expect in terms of your pay and the benefits and the culture. These are the things that we know about this company, and these are the things that I want you to know about it so that you can make an informed choice whether or not you think we are a good match. Because here's the thing, the realistic job preview recognizes that attraction is a two-way street. Poor employers don't assume that. Poor employers assume that it's a privilege for you to apply for them, as we talked about that earlier, right? But a good employer recognizes that recruitment is a two-way street. Attraction is a two-way street. They're not only trying to figure out whether or not they want you to come work for them, but vice versa. They should know and honor that you are trying to predict whether or not they're a good employer for you, whether that'll be a good match for you. Because again, you spend most of your waking hours, 40 hours a week, working for a company, at a minimum 40 hours a week. Most of the time it's 50 or more. So your job is not to sell someone on the company in an unrealistic way, where you only tell them all the good things, or you might exaggerate good things with hyperbole and not really communicate truthful information. So a realistic job preview is about making sure that it's perceived to be fair. And so truthful information and transparency is an important thing. Realistic job previews can have an impact on that. And also it can, your job is to make sure that you're giving them balanced information, some good stuff and some not good stuff. Your goal here isn't to overly inflate the job expectations, nor is it your job to overly deflate the expectations so that you are deterring people from even applying, being so negative that people don't think about the good things of working there. But you want to give them a realistic vision of what it's like so that they can choose on their own whether or not they want to apply and stay and accept a job downstream. The thing is with realistic recruiting, remember, smaller pools, because fewer people will self-select into that pool if you're giving them realistic information. But those who do stay in the pool are committed and they accept the pluses and the minuses of the job, and they are more likely to say yes to the job offer and stay for the long haul. So your impact with a realistic job preview is not necessarily in terms of your direct recruiting metrics, how many stayed in the process, et cetera, but more downstream. How many of them are satisfied with the company? How many of them are loyal to the company? How many are willing to stay with the company over the long haul? That's where your greatest impact is with realistic job previews.